to maintain 2 homes and to live in Washington, D.C. And members of the various state legislatures who are in a travel status get to deduct their expenses as business when they're not in their home jurisdictions. That's not true of senators. That's what you're talking about. Congressman Rostenkowski wants to change it. If the House acts, then it'll come to the Senate.
Okay. You are the second ranking Democrat on the powerful Finance Committee, I believe.
Yes.
Can you explain exactly what that means and what have you done significantly being on that committee?
That means that I'm vice chairman of that committee. It has some 20 members, 10 Democrats and 8 Republicans. It's probably the most important committee of the United States Senate. Its jurisdiction encompasses more matters than any other committee of the Senate.
Okay. Are you thinking about retirement anytime soon?
No, as a matter of fact, I'm asking the people of Georgia to send me back to Washington next year.
And if you get back, do you think you'll want to run another term? Are you tired of politics now?
No. Matter of fact, I've been in it virtually all my adult years. I think I'm in position of greater responsibility. I think my training, background, and experience probably qualifies me to render greater service to the people than ever before.
Is this a difficult job for you, being a senator?
Oh, being in the Senate is difficult. The longer you stay there and the greater your responsibility, the more difficult it is. But that's part of life. I ask for the job and I try to perform it to the best of my ability. It's a very detailed job. Last year I got 220,000 letters. We have 14 telephone lines in my office, including intercoms. Sometimes all of them are busy at the same time. Frequently, several of my committees are meeting simultaneously. I go to the most pressing front and send others to the less pressing front. And so my days usually start about 4 a.m. I don't know when I'll get home, depending on when the Senate adjourns, or whether or not I have engagements downtown that night. So I've worked about an 18-hour day now for well over 30 years. That's 7 days a week. It's not unusual for me.
That's a long,
I enjoy it.
Long day's work.
Yeah.
How did you feel about the overwhelming reception you received from the Georgia General Assembly when
I
you
was
were
pleased
here?
and gratified, of course. Anyone would be.
I'd like to introduce my guest right now, Mr. Lou Davis, who does the commentaries for WSB Channel 2, and also Ms. Pat Moon, who is a Georgia State University student. And you all can begin your questioning.
Senator, I'd like to ask you a little bit about finances. There was an agreement last year, at least made by the Senate leadership, that if Congress got a raise, they would limit outside speeches and money coming in from outside. That has now been turned around. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think you're probably referring to a statement the Majority Leader, Senator Byrd of West Virginia, made, and I admire very greatly Senator Robert Byrd. I was one of his early supporters for Majority Leader. Let me say at the outset that I have never voted for a salary raise in my life in the United States Senate. When I was governor of Georgia in the early 50s, the legislature raised my salary. I declined to accept it. There's over $10,000 in the state treasury at the present time credited to my account that I never drew. And I voted against the so-called salary raise that was voted by the Senate in 1977. And as you pointed out, in addition to the salary raise, the Senate voted that no one who was a member of the Senate could have over 15% of his salary in outside earned income. I voted against that. It's utterly absurd and ridiculous, in my judgment, to make second-class citizens out of members of the United States Senate. Now, if your daddy left you $10 million, it's not illegal. You can clip the coupons. That's unearned income. But if you have a farm and get out there and plow your tractor, then that's earned income and you can't accept it. If you do like some of my colleagues do on weekend, do a little moonlighting and make speeches to try to help send the children to college, that's earned income and illegal.
How important is that earned income to most congressmen?
Oh, I would say that the
Do they
average
need it?
income of members of the Senate from speeches is probably $8,000 to $10,000 a year. Some earn more than others, some less, depending on how well they're known throughout the United States, their attractiveness as a speaker. In one year, when Senator Humphrey was in the Senate, I believe his speaking honorariums were $80,000 odd. I think the highest I've ever had was $30,000 odd. And last year, I think it was something on the order of $20,000 odd. But there's nothing wrong with it. It's purely legitimate. You report it, print it in the news media.
Okay, Pat?
Senator, there's a move afoot right now to require a constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution requiring a balanced budget. How do you feel about that?
I'm strongly supportive of it. And in fact, I guess I was one of the early members of the Senate to offer such a constitutional amendment. I reached the conclusion after being in the Senate a relatively short time that the only way we could ever bring our spending in line with income is to do what Bob Toombs did in 1877 with the Georgia Constitution, to provide that we couldn't spend more money than we collected, except in the event of an emergency. Now, Toombs' emergency was to repel invasion, and that was limited to $5 million, as you know from your Georgia history. And he boasted that he had locked the doors of the Treasury and thrown the key away. Now, the proposed constitutional amendment that I submitted would limit the Congress to expenditures not in excess of the income in any one fiscal year, except in the event of an emergency so declared by the Congress. Now, I think there must be an exception, because we might be in war. We can't lose a war because we cut the balanced budget. We might be in a very serious depression where it's necessary to try to do something about poverty and hunger and unemployment in the country. So those are the only two exceptions in my proposed constitutional amendment.
In that same vein, how do you feel about seeing a constitutional convention?
I would prefer that Congress themselves submit the proposed amendment to the people. There has never been a convention called under Article 5, as you know, in the history of our country. And there's some doubt as to what the power of that constitutional convention would be. I'm worried about a constitutional convention that might be runaway in its characteristics, deal with the Bill of Rights, or any other item that they wanted to. Now, I believe that the Congress has the power to determine the scope of that constitutional convention. I would be in favor of determining the scope, and I would limit it to the question of a balanced budget exclusively.
But even if there were a runaway constitutional convention, everything would have to be ratified by the
Yes,
state
it'd have to be
legislature, so
ratified
there
by
are
three-fourths
safeguards.
of the states, yes.
So there are
And I
safeguards.
trust the states.
What do you think the chances of such an amendment being adopted
28
are?
states now have already, Pat, voted for such a constitutional amendment, and Georgia was one of the early states to so vote. Now, there's some doubt as to the accuracy of that number, because not all of these proposed constitutional amendments are in the same verbiage. Not all of the petitions in the same verbiage. So we'll have to meet that bridge when we get to it. But if just 6 more states move, then it's incumbent upon Congress under Article 5 to act as I read the Constitution.
Senator, you and your office in Washington are the subject of an investigation with the grand jury. Burt Lance is being
Not
investigated.
the grand jury, the
Ethics Committee. Burt Lance is being investigated by a grand jury, and now there's a special prosecutor to check the president's peanut warehouse down in Plains. Is there some sort of vendetta going on against Georgians up there?
I would certainly hope not. My investigation is by the Ethics Committee and not the grand jury. And that was a result, unfortunately, of hostile newspapers rummaging through my financial records for 25 years. And they decided that maybe I had drawn down some expenses in the Senate for reimbursement that I was not entitled to. That was the first news I had of it, because reimbursement of expenditures is probably the lowest item in my senatorial responsibilities. It's handled by some of my assistants in my office. So at my own expense, I paid $4,400 to have my records audited. And I told them to cast every issue against me. And they reported that perhaps we had drawn down something beyond what was authorized. Now, there's no yardstick, no rule. Whatever a senator says is expenses, he signs and that's it. And mine's the only one that's ever been audited out of 1,700 senators. But I reimburse that money, and that's the issue proposed for the Senate right now.
Is there something wrong, though, with the system when these investigations go on and on and
Yes.
on and on?
It's badly wrong.
What sort of change
This
would you
matter
propose?
before the Ethics Committee has been going on now for about 9 months. And of course, unfortunately, the staff in Washington runs lots of things. And there's a staff of director over there on this committee, 74 years of age, and I think he has delusions of great grandeur. He's been running around the country to see if I ever hitchhiked a ride with an airplane or something of that nature, stayed at a hotel without paying the usual fee, and that's the object of the investigation.
Burt Lance is complaining about the same thing with the grand jury, that it's just dragging on and on. What sort of a change would you like to see proposed? What can you do about
Well, any
that?
investigation, I'm a co-sponsor of a bill now for speedy trial in criminal cases. It's a law. And if you're indicted in federal courts, you're entitled as a matter of law to a speedy trial. Otherwise, they have to discharge the individual who's been indicted. So this business of mine's been hanging fire now for 9 months. And it gives
Is that aggravating?
hostile newspaper reporters a vendetta, you know. Yes, it is aggravating. When I know I've done nothing wrong.
That's right. I agree. Pat?
Changing the subject a little bit, do you favor a return to the draft? And if so, what about the inclusion of women in the
Pat,
draft?
I'd be the first to admit that the so-called voluntary Army has not worked very well. Not only the Army, but all other branches of the service. We're short of personnel. We're woefully short of the reserve personnel of our armed services. We spend well over 50% now of the money that we spend for national security for payment of salaries and retirement benefits. That leaves us little to beef up our weapons system. So it has not worked very well. Now, I'm a realist. I know the American people and the Congress are not going to reinstate the draft at the present time. They're opposed to it, as are most of the people that speak for the Pentagon. I don't think the Chief of Staffs are opposed to it, but the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary of the Army, and so on are opposed to it.
Senator,
So I think the best chance of getting something done now is a sort of a standby draft. In other words, to be ready to move when we have to.
okay, we're running out of time, but quickly, would you consider women maybe being used in the service in the reserve force?
I don't want women to ever face a bayonet anywhere, anytime on the face of this earth. But I would support using women, and they are used, in the services in all branches, the Marine Corps, the Army, the Air Force, and everything else, to back up the fellow who wields the bayonet. They're doing that with great dedication.
Thank you very much, Senator
Thank you.
Talmadge. Thank